It seems like every time you turn on the news these days, there's something new happening with Russia and Ukraine. It's a pretty complex situation, and to be honest, it can be kind of hard to keep up with all the twists and turns. But what's even more worrisome is that all this is having huge implications for the whole idea of security in Europe. And that's what we're going to dig into today, based on that report you shared.
Yeah, it's a constantly evolving situation with a lot of moving parts.
Exactly. So we're zeroing in on some of the most recent developments, like Ukraine's attack on that Russian air base, how Russia's been responding, and how those countries right on Russia's border, the Baltic States, are preparing themselves for what could come next. That report you sent really helps us untangle things. It lays out the events as they happen and helps us figure out what might happen next.
It's all about connecting the dots.
Yeah. So our mission here is to sort through all the noise, understand the key actions, and really grasp what this could mean for the future stability of the whole region.
It's a dynamic situation, that's for sure. Every action seems to trigger a reaction, so we need to look at each of these events not in isolation, but as part of this bigger story of the ongoing conflict and how the security landscape in Europe is changing. We'll cover a lot of ground today. This alleged ceasefire violation, that pretty significant drone attack, Russia's potential next moves, the anxieties in the Baltic States and Poland, and how the uncertainty surrounding NATO unity and potential shifts in U.S. policy are all feeding into this situation.
Sounds like a full plate. So let's jump right in with this alleged ceasefire violation. Russia claims that Ukraine basically undermined a U.S. proposed 30-day ceasefire focused on energy sites when they hit that Russian oil depot.
Right.
And Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, even said that it's up to the U.S. now to hold Ukraine accountable. So what's the truth behind this?
Well, this is where it gets interesting because we have this back and forth of different proposals and agreements. Apparently, Putin agreed to this 30-day ceasefire during a conversation with Trump. And the ceasefire was specifically about energy infrastructure, but the U.S. initially wanted a broader ceasefire, a full 30-day ceasefire that included everything, and Ukraine had apparently already agreed to that. So Russia is accusing Ukraine of violating this more limited truce because of that strike on the oil depot.
So it wasn't quite the all-encompassing ceasefire the U.S. had in mind.
No, it wasn't. And this discrepancy in the ceasefire proposals kind of shows that the priorities are different. Russia wants to pause things specifically related to energy, while the U.S. and Ukraine seem to want something much broader, which indicates a lack of trust that's preventing a bigger de-escalation.
Right, it makes sense. And then practically at the same time, you get this audacious drone attack. It hit a major airfield deep inside Russia, something like 700 kilometers from the actual front lines. This wasn't just some small-scale thing, was it? We're talking big explosions, a huge fire.
Oh, absolutely. This attack on the Engels airfield is a big deal for several reasons. First off, both Russian and Ukrainian officials have confirmed it happened, and we've got verified footage showing damage to houses near the airfield, which shows you just how powerful the blast was. Russia claimed they shot down a lot of Ukrainian drones, like 132 across different areas, according to their defense ministry, but this particular drone clearly got through their defenses and made a big impact.
Wow, that's a lot of drones.
Yeah, and the fact that Ukraine pulled off a deep strike like this so successfully suggests their drone technology is getting a lot better. It also points to a potential weakness in Russia's air defense system, making them rethink how secure their strategic assets really are.
And this Engels base, it's not just any old airfield, right?
It's a crucial spot for Russia. They keep their Tupolev Tu-160 bombers there, the ones they call White Swans, which are a really important part of their nuclear deterrent. So, yeah. It's a high-value target, for sure.
It definitely is. And for Ukraine to hit such a strategically important site, so far from the actual fighting, it raises questions about how effective Russia's air defenses really are. And it shows how Ukraine's capabilities for long-range strikes are improving.
Exactly. Even though Ukraine's initial statement didn't directly confirm that they hit the airbase itself, they did acknowledge the drone attack in the Engels area, the fire that followed, and the fact that residents had to be evacuated. That speaks volumes about the impact and strategic significance of this whole operation.
It seems like things are getting more and more tense, and it's understandable that neighboring countries, particularly those in the Baltic States, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, are worried. They're right next to Russia, and their security has always depended on being part of NATO. But in that report you gave me, it highlights how some of Trump's past statements on U.S. military support are making them nervous.
Yeah, if you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it's easy to see why they're so concerned. Trump's said pretty directly that the U.S. might not automatically come to defend its European allies. That would be a huge change from how U.S. foreign policies worked for decades. You have to remember that the Baltic States were part of the Soviet Union, and Putin's been pretty clear about wanting them back in Russia's sphere of influence. So this uncertainty about whether the U.S. will back them up is a really big deal.
I can only imagine. It makes you wonder, what if Russia manages to achieve some sort of victory, whatever that might look like in Ukraine? Could the Baltic states be next on the list, especially if there's a growing feeling that the U.S. might not be there to defend them?
Yeah.
Not a pleasant thought, especially for those countries.
It's a chilling thought, and it raises a big question about what Russia's ultimate goals are and whether NATO can really deter them. Intelligence officials in Europe are increasingly saying that even if there's a ceasefire in Ukraine, it doesn't mean the threat from Russia goes away. They think there's a real chance of conflict with Russia in the next few years, maybe 3, 5, or even 10. And Russia's economy is now almost completely focused on war. Close to 40% of their federal budget goes to defense and internal security, which is a clear sign of their long-term military ambitions.
That's a huge chunk of their national budget.
Yeah, it shows they're serious about building up their military and security apparatus. They're investing heavily in production capacity.
When you look at Estonia in particular, their border with Russia seems like a really tense spot, especially around Narva. There are these medieval fortresses right across a narrow river from each other, the Russian flag on one side and the Estonian flag on the other. It's a scene straight out of history, but the anxieties there are very much in the present.
And what's striking is this constant low-level tension and those deliberate provocations. The Estonian border police chief has said this kind of thing from the Russian border guards isn't new. They've actually caught them on camera removing Estonian boundary buoys in the middle of the night.
Seriously?
Yeah. And it's not just that. There's also constant GPS jamming, which makes it really hard for them to monitor the border properly using their drones, helicopters, and planes, anything that needs accurate GPS.
I bet. And then you see pictures of those dragon's teeth, those concrete anti-tank obstacles on the Estonian side. It's a very real reminder that there could be incursions by land. Even if they're not expecting a full-blown tank invasion, it's those smaller destabilizing actions that worry them.
Absolutely. And when you consider the demographics of Narva, it adds another layer of complexity for Estonia. About 96% of the people there are native Russian speakers, and many of them have dual Russian citizenship. Estonia is afraid that Putin might use this to justify some kind of intervention, kind of like what we saw in Georgia and Ukraine. That's the context for why Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland are now trying to pull out of that international treaty that bans anti-personnel mines. They want to have more options for defending their borders.
Makes sense.
And remember, Lithuania already backed out of a different agreement banning cluster bombs. It's a big shift in their defensive strategies.
It sounds like these nations are doing everything they can to strengthen their defenses. But the report also talks about Russia possibly targeting countries that aren't in NATO. Camille Grand, the former Assistant Secretary General of NATO, thinks Moldova might be next after Ukraine.
Right.
He says that's because attacking a non-NATO country like Moldova wouldn't risk the same kind of international military response.
And that's a crucial point. While everyone's focused on NATO's eastern border, those non-NATO countries nearby or within Russia's historical sphere of influence are really vulnerable. Moldova fits that profile because it's already got internal political divisions and Russian troops in Transnistria. From Russia's point of view, it might seem like a less risky target.
It's interesting how the whole strategic situation around the Baltic Sea has changed. The Baltic nations used to be seen as kind of isolated from the main NATO members in Western Europe, which made defending them harder. But now that Sweden and Finland are in NATO, the whole Baltic Sea region has a different security dynamic.
Totally. Camille Grand even said the Baltic Sea has become the NATO Sea, and that really sums it up. Now that NATO has a bigger presence there, and Sweden and Finland, who have strong militaries, are involved, any plans Russia might have for the Baltic Sea area are much more complicated and probably less appealing.
That's a good point.
So the whole dynamic has changed.
For sure. But even with these positive changes for NATO in the region, the report says that the biggest risk of a wider conflict might not be an intentional attack, but a miscalculation. In a situation this tense, things can easily escalate. And even if there's peace in Ukraine, Russia will probably keep using cyber attacks, spreading misinformation, and engaging in sabotage and espionage all over Europe. We're dealing with a very different kind of battlefield these days.
Yeah, modern warfare isn't just about tanks and soldiers anymore. These so-called hybrid tactics are all about destabilizing societies from the inside, creating distrust and division without actually triggering a full-scale military response from NATO. That means the targeted countries need to be really vigilant and resilient and work together to counter these threats.
Which brings us to a really important and kind of uncomfortable question. Is NATO really willing to respond decisively if things escalate? Would major NATO members like the US, France, Italy, or the UK really risk going to war with Russia, a country with nuclear weapons, over a relatively small area like Narva? And what if Russia uses those shady paramilitary forces again like they did in Donbas in 2014, the ones without any official Russian markings? Would NATO actually respond with full force?
Those are the tough questions at the heart of collective security. What worries the Baltic states is that NATO might hesitate or respond too slowly and weakly if Russia makes a limited, indirect move. Even without a full-scale invasion, these kinds of ambiguous actions could really destabilize the region, scare off investors, and have long-term negative effects on their political and economic stability. That uncertainty about how NATO will respond is exactly what Russia might try to exploit.
And then you've got the added uncertainty about what U.S. foreign policy will be like, especially if Trump becomes president again. If the U.S. reduces its military presence in Europe or pulls out completely, that would really change the balance of power and leave European countries feeling very vulnerable.
There's no doubt that's a major factor driving the anxiety and the steps we're seeing the Baltic states and Poland taking to prepare for the worst. Estonia's defense minister, Hanno Pevkur, recently said that he's cautiously optimistic about NATO's commitment to collective defense. But he also emphasized that Europe needs to take more responsibility for its own security. His question, are we together or not, really sums up the dilemma they're facing.
Yeah, it really does. And the response from these frontline countries has been pretty striking. Poland saying that every adult male needs to be ready for battle. And considering that French proposal to extend their nuclear umbrella, those are big moves.
Definitely.
And then you've got Estonia passing laws requiring new buildings to have bunkers or bomb shelters. And their pledge to increase defense spending to 5% of their GDP next year. Lithuania wants to spend even more, 5% to 6%.
Wow.
And Poland's not far behind. They're aiming for 4.7% of their GDP on defense, with a goal of having the biggest army in Europe. That's a huge commitment, especially when you compare it to the US, which spends around 3.7% of its GDP on defense, and the UK, which is currently at 2.3% and planning to increase to 2.6%.
Those figures really put things in perspective. These countries aren't messing around. They're showing a serious, unwavering commitment to defending themselves and the region as a whole.
Absolutely.
And Estonia's decision to build closer ties with key allies, particularly the UK, who are already heavily involved in Estonia's defense, shows that they're being proactive and looking for reliable security partners. You know, the UK has about 900 personnel stationed in Estonia, their biggest permanent overseas deployment, and they're planning to increase that number.
That's significant.
It is. And there's that NATO base in Tapa with British armored vehicles and Challenger tanks. A British squadron leader said that NATO feels exposed and that the Baltics are a crucial flank. So they're taking it very seriously.
And Estonia isn't just focusing on equipment. They're stress testing their new army bunkers and investing heavily in drone technology. They're learning from what's happening in Ukraine and adapting their strategies. It's clear that they see this threat as very real, even though they know their own military might not be enough to stop a full-scale invasion. They're building layers of defense and trying to make it clear that attacking them wouldn't be easy.
Exactly. They're essentially Putin-proofing their countries as best they can while dealing with all this geopolitical uncertainty and with the situation in Ukraine still unresolved. They're adapting to a whole new security landscape on Europe's eastern border.
So to wrap things up, here are the key takeaways. Tensions are definitely escalating, with events like that drone attack and the back and forth about ceasefires. Russia's clearly committed to building up its military strength for the long haul, and the Baltic states and Poland are taking very concrete steps to strengthen their defenses because they're deeply concerned about Russia's intentions and whether the U.S. will be there to support them in the future.
Yeah, and it all comes down to a really fundamental question. In this unpredictable time, with a powerful and potentially expansionist neighbor right there, what does it really mean for a country to be prepared? Are the measures the Baltic states and Poland are taking actually enough to counter such a complex and multifaceted threat? And what do these big changes in defense strategy mean for the future of security in Europe and for the whole idea of collective defense that NATO's been based on for so long? These are the crucial questions we need to keep asking as these events unfold because they'll shape the future of the region.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been eye-opening. And for all of you listening, as you go about your day, think about this. What does it truly mean for a country to be ready for whatever might come next? It's a question worth pondering.